Alrighty, hello every folks, and welcome to A Nightmare. So today we're going to be discussing defining strategy RPGs. Something that notoriously has been very difficult to actually do for a decently long time. Because no matter who you ask, everyone's going to have a different opinion of what a strategy RPG even is. Everyone's got some very specific definition that'll fit for them, and that's part of what makes it so difficult. How exactly do you define a genre where almost every major player has approached it from a completely different angle? Hell, we even have Tactics Ogre, who has not had the same mechanics for any two of the games throughout the entire series. So we've got a case where there's so many unique. I guess you could argue it's the genre equivalent of too many chefs in the kitchen. You know, that there's so many that tried to do some unique thing, and very few that actually copy other ones directly. Everybody's got their own take on everything, which is both a good or a bad thing, depending entirely on the day, situation, and what have you. So, to that end, let's go ahead and discuss a little bit. Let's go discuss what makes this thing a little bit of a nightmare, what I personally consider to be the sort of accurate definition of an SRPG, which will definitely be not what somebody else thinks for sure, and yeah, to that end, also I'm curious to see how this is going to go, because despite the fact that I've been reattempting this video for weeks and constantly hating it and throwing it in the trash and starting over, apparently we've also potentially got one coming from Titanium Legman, so I'm really curious to see his take on this idea too, because it's one of those notorious bugbears that's just always kind of there. No one can ever really agree on an exact definition for a lot of this stuff, and that's part of what makes it fun to talk about. Okay, so to my mind, essentially what you need for your strategy RPG are the RPG part. So you've got the numbers, you've got the chessboard, and you've got the situation. Now, what is the situation? Wait a minute, don't you mean a story? Not really, because a lot of SRPGs don't necessarily need a story either. They don't necessarily need anything more than what fleshes out their situation. See, to my mind, when it comes to a strategy RPG, the thing that actually makes it stand out, the reason that the chessboard here, is important is because of what it creates. It's essentially a lens for your characters to grow from. Essentially, a situation that you've got your people, you've got your characters, you've got your stats and what have you, but really the board is what ends up defining them. The board is there to essentially provide a scale of the world that otherwise would not necessarily be there, that in many RPGs is something that they potentially struggle with, or would have to take a more direct approach with. So, like, let's say we take a look at something like, you know, Final Fantasy X, right? We've got interactions with the map, being able to go around and activate different props and what have you, but is it a strategy RPG? No, because there's really not much strategy to it. It's just random interactions that happen there, and yes, the main strategy is technically there in terms of the kind of individual and, you know, party builds and what have you. You know what I'm getting at here, that you're not necessarily positioning to, let's say, get a flank on somebody or whatever else. Technically, you can move around the map sometimes, but that's not a ever-present thing, and it's not necessarily the lens as much as it is an additional interaction that you're doing there. Let's take, for example, something like Tactics Ogre. What exactly is the point of the interaction on the map? Well, it's for the purpose of surrounding your enemies, it's for the purpose of trapping them in hallways, for providing those kind of awkward wins that get around the stat sheet. It's essentially having the stat sheet and giving you the means to bypass it at the same time. Essentially solving the problem that it created in the first place, as it were. So, to my mind, when it comes to being a strategy RPG, part of it is that, again, the map has to be a sort of lens for your people to show their personality through. This is supposed to be a fairly gritty setting, so the situations where your knight uses his shield to go throw somebody against a wall and mercilessly beats them to death, yeah, that's very appropriate for this setting. Those situations where you're playing Knight of Lotus and you pick up Nishart and throw him off the damn wall, yeah, that asshole deserved it. And again, it provides a sort of lens for characterization for your people through a very unusual means, you know? Essentially giving you the means of kind of showing off your people's personality in a way that isn't just on the stat sheet. And again, doesn't necessarily give you the freedom of something like an isometric RPG. It's kind of the middle ground between an IRPG and just a standard RPG by any other definition. Sort of being this the situation where you have the implied interactions of something like an isometric RPG, the implied interactions of something more D&D like, But at the same time, taking it back just a little bit so that you can understand all of it at a moment's notice, like a chess game. That you can notice the pieces in front of you, understand what exactly they can potentially provide for you, and essentially it has to be in that exact circle where it's noticeable at a moment's notice. You see it and you see what's happening. You don't necessarily need to know the full character build that got them there. You don't need to know the metas. You can see where people are and believe their situation based on where they are. It's kind of like a scene that presents itself, if that makes sense. A scene that sort of shoots itself, so to speak. Like, for example, you take a look at fights in something like XCOM, and you'll see very dramatic moments that play out moment to moment all the damn time for that exact reason. That all the classes are very distinctive, the way that they interact with the map is very distinctive, and the situation, while the story is fairly bare bones, it does still provide a reason for everyone to be fighting. Which actually gets me to the next thing in terms of the generics. Why exactly do so many SRPGs have generics? Because in many ways those generics are, again, just sort of a lens into the world there. That this is a situation that doesn't necessarily require heroes as much as it requires just people doing the dirty work, you know? Essentially, it's easier to get into the story, to get into the world, when it feels like you could be any one of these random soldiers that's here. That it's not a world that's trying to present a bunch of superheroes or what have you, it's trying to present a bunch of people that are, you know, making it by and living in this world. To my mind, it's a weird way of kind of presenting everything, where you sort of have a faceless main character, but you also have many faceless characters following the character with a face. It's one of those things you see in SRPGs all the time. One of those things that, funnily enough, even Unsung Story tried to get around, but ultimately it's kind of one of the key pillars of what makes this work. That it's not necessarily that you are directly the kind of commander sort, you're the person that could potentially be following the commander, that you could be any of the people that are here. At least that's the way that I see it. So anyways, next let me get to the like thing. So one of the frustrating things that comes to trying to explain anything in this genre and trying to recommend anything from the genre is the like factor. And probably nowhere is this easier to see than the Final Fantasy Tactics like. Because tell me one Final Fantasy Tactics like that doesn't piss off a Final Fantasy Tactics fan. That is a weird way to emphasize that. Thanks, Brain. I appreciate the weird mush you're turning into. Anyway, so for example, Final Fantasy Tactics, what was it about? Well, interesting class system. You're on a chessboard, you have an interesting time system in which your spells are required to take time, your abilities take time to activate, and additionally, your skills are kind of bought off a table there. Your gear and equipment isn't really much that's going to stick out until you get towards kind of later in the game and you have a few more unique options. And generally speaking, most of your interesting stuff build-wise comes from your comes from the skills that you buy, and your ability to just kind of cheese those skills for a win. Now, okay, that's awesome. That's, you know, fantastic game, really fun to play. Quick couple of notes on that though, because the story. So the story is all about class warfare. Essentially, people struggling under various socioeconomic backgrounds, trying to get by in a world that more or less has less than zero bit of a shit to give about them, and they in general just yeah, they're all suffering to get by. Everybody hates everything for the most part, and yeah, it's not a happy place. It's not a happy place to be, right? The thing is, you never really feel that in gameplay, and that's the thing that I'm really expecting that they're going to go and attempt to rework once they get to the Final Fantasy Tactics Remake. Now, why is that important? The class system is fun to play with. Yes, but remember that all of this stuff is working together to give you the same illusions of something like an IRPG, giving a lot of sort of tabletop-esque interactions, while at the same time being simple enough that it's understandable at a moment's notice. This is why, for example, if we take a look at something like Tactics over here, it's like, oh man, they have all these different resistances, all these different damage types, these skill bonuses that they're providing, and realistically, what do I care about 99% of the time? Well, this archer over here can go and disable somebody, and I'm gonna go ahead and have them do that. Again, it's just kind of reaching that middle ground of you don't necessarily need to peek into the stat sheet, but you can if you need to. The sort of functional equivalent of DIYing your car, where it's like, yeah, you don't necessarily need to know how to operate every part of the car, but it's a good idea to understand the basic fundamentals of replacing a belt every now and then, you know? Anyway. So to that end, let's go ahead and look at some FFT likes to explain what I mean. So when it comes to FFT likes, it's funny because even the FFT sequels are not FFT-like enough for a lot of FFT fans. Like, when it comes to the socioeconomic thing, in FFT, it was very, at least in my opinion, kind of difficult to take that part seriously. There has to be a little bit of a separation of church and state going on there, of like, okay, you know, we're gonna believe that that these Lakavian stuff are a bit of a threat, even though my monk just went and tore them in half with his bare hands. But you know, there has to be a little bit of just kind of putting some of that aside in favor of understanding that the story is kind of its own thing, right? That even though it's one of the classics of the genre, there, it didn't necessarily pull that particular aspect off. Funnily enough, its sequel, which is oftentimes seen as the less serious kiddie version, FFTA, arguably pulled it off way better, wherein it made you feel a lot of those same elements. So, like those, the idea that you're meant to feel oppressed by the world at large. Like, right from the very first cutscene, a guy is injured and tries to heal himself, but oh shoot, medicine's illegal that day, off to jail you go. You know, that kind of stuff, where immediately, right from the get-go, there was this very clear understanding of like, no, you don't understand. They don't really have a choice. This is just their situation. Random stuff just happens during the day. And from our perspective, it's like, okay, so that seems like complete crap. Why would anybody live under this system? Well, obviously it's not really necessarily their choice, but it gamifies that kind of oppression, and additionally, I would argue makes a pretty solid case as far as corruption of power goes. Because as soon as you realize, hey, shoot, that entire enemy team is using fire weapons, it would be a real shame if we made fire illegal that day. That's kind of when you're suddenly realizing, wait a minute, maybe this corrupt system ain't so bad if I'm the one benefiting from it. Again, I would argue it makes a really good case as far as that goes. It presents that particular story beat pretty darn well, in my opinion. But anyways, it generally got panned because it didn't have the same systems, that the story featured more. This was around the point that I feel like a lot of players were kind of in their teens, so they typically had that more like, oh, I gotta feel like a big boy mode thing, going on. So I feel like some of it was that whole just wanting to feel like a grown-up thing. But anyways, as far as FFTA goes, I would argue that it did actually explain that particular thing, or that it explored that particular topic arguably a bit better, even though the story was worse written. But anyways, what I'm trying to get across here, though, is that, again, it's that interaction of essentially the field that you're fighting on, providing a different lens to view everything from. Like, seeing somebody limp off into an alleyway. It doesn't... When it's happening in a cutscene, it's a little bit difficult to take seriously, you know? It's a little bit difficult to be like, oh, you know, I buy that guy potentially going and dying in this cutscene because it's a cutscene. Whereas, let's say, if you're seeing this happening in gameplay, it's suddenly a very different feeling, you know? That it's a feeling of like, yeah, you saw that guy go crawl over and, try to use that medicine and get himself arrested. You saw that moment where a generic, let's say, came out and was trying to, let's say, fight somebody way stronger than them, and they ended up limping away in something like FFT, right? That they ended up limping away and just finding themselves cornered or whatever else. The map is providing a sort of lens to that particular dynamic. That if it was just people standing in a line wailing on each other, they wouldn't necessarily be able to show that as effectively, if that makes sense. So it gives people that ability to interact with the map while not necessarily getting as crazy, complicated, and hard to understand as, again, like a Baldur's Gate or something, right? So anyways, with that said, though, let's talk about other FFTA likes, or FFT likes, because the comparisons don't end there. Where for example, one of those frustrating things is like when you try to recommend a game to somebody, and they will be upset at some feature or another, like the FFT system, the class system. A lot of people played it for that alone, and that's awesome, great, it's a fun system. And what exactly did folks have an issue with? Well, they had an issue with stuff like Felseal, where, for example, it had an arguably way improved version of that class system, a spawn system that took very good advantage of it, as well as just a lot of really kind of fun challenge mode kind of mechanics, and for a lot of folks that specifically were there for mechanics, it really scratched that FFT-like itch. But the ones that needed the story attached to it oftentimes found themselves fairly upset at the fact that it didn't necessarily have those same exact features. Okay, so that's a little bit of a bummer. Whatever, fine. Let's move on then. So okay, what about, so they need the story, right? They need the story to be there, so let's recommend a Tactics Ogre. And, you know, you got Tactics Ogre that's literally written by the same guy. It's basically the same story with more story interactions. It's like, no, now it doesn't have, you know, the same cross-classing system. Okay, fine. So what you're saying is you'll accept FFT and absolutely nothing else. Let's just be honest about that then. But again, it's like it doesn't matter what game it is. Somebody will have that same exact thing that ends up happening. That they'll want something like one thing, but like basically specifically refuse unless it is that exact same thing again because of how unique it was in the first place. Even like let's take something like Kingsbane. If you've never tried it, good lord, go buy Kingsbane right now. But but effectively, what Kingsbane was. I was one of those interesting experiences where it did, for the first time in a long time, give completely new memories of a brand new thing for me personally. So Kingsbane was what I would describe as like strategy Dark Souls, not in terms of its difficulty, but in terms of its exploration. And actually, you know what? Maybe I should just show it. Okie dokie. So this is Kingsbane. So this is one of my favorite things to come out in years here. I know it doesn't look like much at first glance, but bear with me here. So this was an indie project that again was kind of pitched to me as FFT-like, being a game in which you essentially unlocked skills in the same way that FFT does. Every one of your characters is going around with multiple classes, just like an FFT-like. But the main gimmick is that you've effectively got kind of Dark Souls type exploration, while at the same time being a game in which you're able to interact the world pretty much in whatever way you see fit. It's like, let's say we wanted to get past this lake, and we didn't want to do a puzzle to get a hold of a boat. The way that we might be able to do that is essentially just by freezing the lake solid under our feet, using one of the classes that has access to ice. You know, and we would just be able to just kind of sequence break to our heart's content, going that way. Or potentially, let's say there's going to be other sections of the map where we can interact with any other skills. Pretty much everything that you picked up along the way was by some means going to allow you to interact with the world around you. Meaning that despite the fact that this is technically marked as FFT-like, it's a game that in many ways achieves, well, a very similar feeling in a completely different way, despite, again, being similar but also extremely dissimilar at the same time. Like in this case, when it came to FFT-likes, I loved setting up various kinds of traps in every one of these games. Like in this one right here, I was having some difficulty with a fight. Technically, this was way earlier than I was supposed to be here, and later I found out I didn't even have to be here at all. And so I just booby-trapped the ever-loving hell out of this area, and it gave a very particular feeling every time I ran by. I was like, man, I remember exactly what happened here. That effectively it's taking that same concept of the SRPG being the field that you interact with and kind of taking it up to 11 where you just never leave the field at all, where every one of your skills again is used to interact with the world around you, however that potentially takes shape here. Like, if for some reason you wanted to go use a pull chain to go pull a torch into yourself to set yourself on fire, that's technically an option. But it's interesting because, again, this is the map being used to achieve this result. Like, to me, this right here, this is one of those areas I wanted to revisit. It's a fairly inconsequential area with a fairly easy fight that just sort of happened to be here. Just some random stuff flops down onto this bridge. But it forever cemented in my mind this kind of very particular feeling of this bridge with, you know, the wind blowing, with you know, being on top of this fairly isolated, desolate area, you know, just feeling like this place was the farthest possible place from home, even though the actual kind of base watchtower area here is not too far away. And again, this just kind of goes back to that same thing of when it comes to defining SRPGs. I think really all it comes down to is just, is it an RPG with a chessboard, more or less? Because every one of these is going to be attempting to essentially do something completely unique. It's one of the very few genres that, frankly, has so little kind of, I guess you could say, repeat content in terms of the same thing getting milled over and over because of how niche it is. Because how many developers can even afford to take a risk on something like an SRPG? Very, very few, right? Even when we had something like the absolutely incredible Unicorn Overlord, whose music you hear here, it didn't have a chessboard. Yeah, it had a fully 3D environment for you to go and jog around in. And yeah, that was absolutely incredible. It was great to be able to move around in the full space, but the squares were never the factor. The map, your interactions, that feeling of scale was what was important. Because remember that a lot of these games come from war games originally. That they come from this idea that sometimes the story isn't told by the heroes that were there. It isn't told by the important faces on top of every faction. Sometimes it's just told by the grunts. Sometimes the story is told from the ground up. Sometimes those are the ones that end up really having a bit more of an interesting story to tell than the guy that ordered the war in the first place. And to my mind, that's the kind of setting that an SRPG, that's kind of the unique feeling that the SRPG really pulls off through things like generic units on either side, things like the just kind of interesting sort of, I guess you could say, ascended extra feeling that a lot of your characters can end up having. That's one of those things that really defines a SRPG to me personally. For example, let's go ahead and take a look at something like Xenonauts. XCOM, things like that. Like XCOM 2, as far as I'm concerned, that's not really much of a question. You've got the stats, you're straight up fighting wizards with swords. Yeah, dude, that mess is an SRPG top to bottom. It's a fantasy SRPG on top of that. But let's go ahead and take a look at some of the other stuff out here. Namely, we're taking a peek at Xenonauts 2 in this particular case. Is this an SRPG? Well, let's see. This guy's stats are determining this shot. This shot over here might potentially determine the outcome of this war here. So, it seems like it's at least a little bit important. So, I'm going to say that odds are pretty good that there's a pretty dramatic situation that's happening here. So we'll go ahead and take that nice little happy shot right there. Hopefully get all these guys nice and pasted. We could have a wizard splatting AoEs, but I think a grenade does that job pretty good too. In this particular case, by the way, if you've never played Xeno 2, there's ambush maps, so we basically just get a free turn to absolutely annihilate these guys. If you screw up an ambush, I don't know what you're doing. Anyway, so yeah, as far as I'm concerned, this is also an SRPG, because it is still telling a story. It is still essentially telling you the struggles of this organization, with the organization itself as the character, not necessarily the people themselves. These soldiers are replaceable. They're very replaceable. They're often replaced within a week. But it's telling the story of the organization and its struggles. It's effectively just one very, very long Helm's Deep, as it were, with constant struggles versus various types of different enemies, with various types of different tools and strategies constantly being employed, different tools constantly being the most important thing of the week, stuff that seems important one week ultimately turning out to be kind of a nothing burger by the next. Again, as far as I'm concerned, it is still an SRPG here. Because again, you've got the people with the stats, you've got the characters that are fighting against a seemingly unknowable thing. You've got all the typical RPG kind of tropes in that regard. You've still got weapons and armor on your people, if that's how you want to choose to define it. And additionally, despite the fact that this is a more modern setting, I mean, all these people are still running around with various stats and what have you, so I don't see anything in particular that prevents it from being a RPG in that regard, or strategy RPG in that regard. You're still playing the role of this organization, of these particular soldiers here, of apparently a completely blind soldier in this case, kind of constantly missing and messing up. And this actually is one of those other things. That an SRPG doesn't always have to be a power fantasy. Sometimes it can be a depowering fantasy. In this particular case, XCOM, like XCOM, Xenonauts, all these kinds of things here, oftentimes the way that they end up playing out can feel very chaotic. It can feel like your people are almost intentionally making mistakes all the time, just making dumb blunders that you then have to go and play around. And yeah, that's also entirely a valid kind of approach as far as I'm concerned. That in situations like this where our soldiers are randomly missing one particular shot, or in stuff like Tactics Ogre where your soldiers may randomly get parried and stuff like that, the randomness is not necessarily a sign of the game being lazy and trying to be artificially difficult. Essentially, it's a sign that it's trying to create that sort of kind of randomness feeling, that feeling that your people can make mistakes, that they can make dumb blunders that you then have to play around. It makes them more human, and this more human exploration of the standard RPG format, to my mind, is a large part of what makes a SRPG. because regular RPGs, even when they try to be more down-to-earth, like stuff like your, I guess you could argue Personas, where they'll be exploring slice-of-life type of stuff, still will oftentimes find themselves in that position where realistically they're still kind of gods at the end of the day, you know? Whereas the strategy RPG genre, in my mind, is more the story of the nobodies trying to overcome something completely out of their depth, even when they are themselves kind of insane. Like, obviously, we do have stuff like Disgaea or whatnot, but hell, even compared with the powers that be in that particular universe, your nobody generics are still nobody generics. When it comes to your Fire Emblems, yes, you are exploring them through various fancier soldiers and whatnot, but as time went on, they added more and more of these kind of everyday Joe kind of characters, as it were. And they've always had these everyday nobodies in the team there. It's exploring, again, attempting to explore the world from more perspectives at once without necessarily going as insanely deep and lore-heavy as an IRPG would, without necessarily going into everyone's personal drama like a JRPG would, without necessarily as much dismemberment as a Western RPG would, while still, you know, attempting to give you essentially the RPG experience on a chessboard, as it were. So if it's got the stats, if it's got the board, if it's got the scene, to my mind, it's an SRPG. Which means that it very broadly covers an absolute hell of a lot of different things, but I think it fits. Again, they are broadly very difficult to categorize for that exact reason, because everyone's got a different requirement. But to my mind, it's not something that can be conveniently shoved into a box. SRPGs as a whole are such a wide-ranging kind of group of different things, and whether you want to call them SRPGs, tactical RPGs, what have you, I personally don't think that there's that meaningful of a distinction between them. Like, for example, many will refer to Xenonauts as a tactical RPG. Okay, all well and good. What's more tactical about this than, let's say, Tactics Ogre? You've still got people worrying about the facing of their weapons. You've still got people worrying about the loadouts that they're bringing to there. You've still essentially got people worrying about mind control on a day-to-day basis. So what exactly is more tactical here than it was in a Tactics Ogre? Whereas Tactics Ogre, which has tactics in the name, is considered a strategy RPG. It's a meaningless distinction as far as I'm concerned, just to make some people feel, you know, slightly more edgy, I think. But yeah. Again, as I was saying earlier, we've got the people, we've got the stats, we've got the gear, we've got the plot, as it were. If we want to go dig through the Xenopedia here and read about all this plot, we technically have it. But when it comes to you know, maybe seeing this all day to day, we don't necessarily need all of this stuff here today, day to day, but whenever we're feeling particularly immersed, whenever we're feeling particularly into understanding all this stuff, we can always go deeper. It is, SRPGs at the end of the day are just like isometric RPGs, but with a focus on flow and an intention to just sort of keep you playing the game, but then as soon as you're ready to slow down, the lore is there waiting for you. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense, because that's typically how they end up playing out. Except for the times that they don't. Although more often than not, they do have some kind of UFOpedia in this case, or Xenopedia in this case. UFOpedia in XCOM's case. You've got the Warren Report in Tactics Ogre's case. You've got What's-His-Face's report in Final Fantasy Tactics. You've got the Journal in any Rad Codex game. You've got basically any of the random side NPCs in the Disgaea game. In Fire Emblem, you've got 1,000,001 YouTube channels. In the case of... I haven't really played Fate Tactics yet. I'm sure it's got something like that. It's been a staple since forever. Like, basically since FFT, since Tactics Ogre, they've always had the encyclopedia. Like, the bit that you go to when you're ready for more lore up in your face. But until you're ready for that lore, you've got a happy little depressing chessboard. Okay, was this video useful? I mean, I hope so. I don't know if it actually helped to define anything any clearer, but this was a fun little ramble to go on. Alright, thank you all for stopping by, and yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Take care. And also, if you made it this far, and you're somehow still here, Titanium Legman, I'm still waiting for your take on this, because I'm predicting that's what your video is going to be there. There have been enough polls to make it a thing. It's probably going to be way more coherent than this one. Alright, anyway, moving on.